My name is Alexandra Bravac, and today I'm introducing you my thesis titled Whose Life Is It? This work is a comparative analysis of two of the most influential concepts in Eastern thought, the Atman and the Buddhist Anatman. We are investigating a question that is over 2,500 years old, yet remains the most personal and relevant inquiry that one can make before every other question, I think. Who is the I that is living this life? Where does our sense of self identity or subjectivity come from in the first place? How can we interpret the no common expression, inherited fate? If everything is a subject to change, how are transgenerational patterns inherited at all? Did the Buddha deny the soul by non-self, as is often assumed? With the Dalai Lama words, everyone seeks happiness and strives to reduce suffering. Therefore, the central question remains the one of the most fundamental questions of human existence. It is the self and therefore suffering and depending construction. My primary objective was to trace the profound Vedic and Upanishadic concept of Atman, the eternal soul, and follow if it is a transformation into the Buddhist doctrine of Anatman, which views the self as a process. I explored whether these two concepts are truly irreconcilable opposites, as they are often portrayed, or if they just represent different nuanced dimensions of the same phenomenological experience. In other words, are we looking at a fundamental dichotomy or a shift in a perspective from being to becoming? To answer this, my research focused on three main pillars. I analyzed how interpretations moved from a kind of substantialism, the idea of a solid core, to a process philosophy. Then I delved deeply into the Madhyamaka school, especially Nagarjuna's logic of emptiness, shunyata, and the Yogacara model of consciousness, which provides a functional explanation for continuity. And then I looked up the connection to the Tathagata Garbha teachings. Finally, my research bridges ancient wisdom with contemporary disciplines. We look how these insights interface with modern cognitive science and the functionalist models used in artificial intelligence today. With this roadmap in mind, let us first look how the self is defined differently in the West compared to the East in the roots of psychology. In the West, at the birth of psychoanalysis, the goal has been the individualization of the creation of a strong ego, seeking a healthy, stable core of personality to resolve our traumas or just for better understanding our lives. We assume that there is a permanent core or a soul which needs healing, repair, or development. In contrast, the traditions we are examining today suggest that the patient is not the ego, but, so to speak, the disease itself. While one side asks, how can I be a better me? The other asks, what is the true nature of the one who wants to be better? To understand the Buddha's words, Liput Sondi, the founder of faith analysis in German Schicksalsanalyse, can also bring us closer. He presents the following concept of the self. The self is neither an object nor a subject, but a mediator between the object and the subject. While Freud focused mainly on the personal, unconscious, depressing, the repressing desires, and Jung on the collective unconscious, universal archetypes. Sondi discovered the middle layer, the familial unconscious. The self is energy manifested in one's actions and experiences, which do not disappear. By Sondi, the energy is passed from generation to generation as a bundle in our hidden genes. Okay, let's first look at the language. The exact etymology of the word Atman is not entirely certain, but it likely derives from the roots an, which means to breathe, to live, or at, to move, or va, to blow. This is a beautiful connection that we see in many languages. Think of the German Atman or the Greek Atmos. In its earlier sense, the self was simply the breath, the invisible force that moves the body. Over centuries, this biological observation was elevated into a metaphysical absolute, the soul as the unchanging essence of life. In the Upanishads, this concept reached its peak. Here, the Atman is refined as Satchit Ananda, eternal existence, pure consciousness and bliss. The most revolutionary teaching here is the non-dual identity expressed, Tat Tvam Asi, that you are. It claims that your individual core is not just like the ultimate reality of the universe. It is that reality. Brahman is the macrocosm, and Atman is the microcosm. To find the self is to find God within ourselves. However, we understand that Indian thought is not a monolith. While, for example, the Advaita Vedanta school um, preached total identity, the Sankhya school proposed a kind of dualism, distinguishing between Purusha, the passive witness, and Prakriti, the active world of matter. In Sankhya, the self is like a mirror. It reflects the world, but is never changed by it. This idea of a detached witness formed the philosophical environment into the Buddha was born. Having explored the heights of the concept of the eternal Atman, we now arrive at a significant turning point, what I call the Buddhist shift. As you can see or imagine, this shift is rooted in a very specific logic. An important difference is a big change or a turn in the point of the view, opening a new window to former schools who tried to define what the self is. The Buddha went further from the unchanged mirror and said only the process of reflection exists. Some early Buddhist thinkers, however, came to the conviction that the self does not exist at all, despite the Buddha's explicit warnings. Whoever grabs the snake, the teaching, in the wrong place will be bitten by it, he said. The teachings should be used not for intellectual boosting, but for liberation. The Buddha critique was not a theoretical disagreement. It was a pragmatic observation about the nature of suffering. He argued that clinging to an unchanged soul is the primary obstacle to our freedom. So any concept of a self, no matter how divine, becomes an object of attachment. The Buddha shifted the focus from substance, what we are, to a process, how we become. This leads to us directly to the doctrine of Anatman, where we realize that the self is not a static rock, but a flowing river. The Buddha is often called the great doctor. When asked metaphysical questions like, is there a soul or what happens after that, he often remained silent. He used the famous parable of a poisoned arrow. If you are shot, you don't ask who shot you or what the arrow is made of. You better pull it right away out if you don't want to die. So these are unuseful questions to reach liberation. I share the view of Thanissaro Bhikkhu, a Buddhist monk and scholar, when he says, the Buddha did not teach that there is no self. He taught that the self is a process, an activity that we are constantly creating. The question is not whether we have a self, but whether the self concept we are currently constructing leads to suffering or not. To prove his point, the Buddha provided a psychological deconstruction of the individual into the five skandhas or aggregates. The Buddha's challenge was simple. Look at these five. Can you find an I in any of them? If the body is not the I, if the thoughts are not the I, and so on, then I is merely a conventional name we give to this shifting pile of processes, much like we call a collection of parts a chariot. The five skandhas are: first, the rupa, the body; second, vedana, the raw feelings; third, sanya, the perception; fourth, samkara, mental habits; and finally, vijnana, consciousness. You cannot read there were a soul or a self. As Buddhism evolved in the Mahayana tradition, this deconstruction became even more radical with the concept of shunyata or emptiness. We know that this doesn't mean nothingness. Just as everything exists and appears in connection to something else, Nagarjuna refined this with cold and hard logic. He states that the key is upadana, which means the 12-fold chain of causality can be broken at clinging. Practitioners, therefore, should focus on the moment of contact and detachment. So during practice, the non-identification will break the cycle of suffering to prevent the arising of the self. But who carries the karma then? The Yogacara school answered this with the alaya vijnana, or storehouse consciousness. Imagine a stream that carries karmic bija, seeds, from one moment to the next. The tragedy of the human ego is that our consciousness looks at this flowing stream and mistakenly says, that is me. This brings us to the Tathagata Garbha concept, which says that in every living being there is a Buddha nature. Some critics say this sounds also like the Átman in Hinduism, but it's not a static soul we possess, but a universal potential for awakening that is currently obscured by our defilements, like the gold hidden in a swamp or the sun behind the clouds. This philosophy has profound ethical consequences. In the earlier traditions, I don't hurt you because we are fundamentally the same soul. In the Buddhist way, I don't hurt you because I see that your suffering and my suffering are part of the same interdependent web. Compassion, karuna, is the natural result of realizing that the walls between self and other are artificial. Ethics is therefore a prerequisite for meditation and consequently for samadhi. The Panchashila creates the inner peace and the outer stability that are indispensable for deeper consciousness. Once we are enlightened, it would not even cross our minds to behave unethically, because then we become ethic itself. So let's have a look at the modern world. Contemporary neuroscience has searched the brain for a command center, but they found nothing like this. Instead, they found a massive network. Between others, Antonio Damasio, the famous neuroscientist, was criticizing Descartes because his theory of splitting the body and the soul. According to Damasio, the mind and the body are not two separate entities, but a single integrated unit. The mind arises from the body's biological processes and the brain's ability to continuously map the body's internal states. Damasio used the analogy of a symphony. Imagine that there is a conductor, and the conductor is like the self, so to say, not existing prior to the music. So he emerges in response to the performance and takes control. We tend to believe consciousness is purely mental. And since Descartes, I think, therefore I am, we have been privileged the mind as the centerpiece of thought and consciousness. But such a view is mistaken, argues Damasio. Feelings, long dismissed as secondary to thinking, are where consciousness begins, and are deeply rooted in the body and its physical processes. Perhaps the most provocative proof of Anatman today is the robot priest Mindar in Kyoto. Mindar recites the Heart Sutra and teaches emptiness to thousands of pilgrims. Mindar has no biological self, no soul, no Atman, yet Mindar fulfills a spiritual function. This forces us to ask, if a soulless machine can transmit the Dharma and evoke a religious experience, doesn't that prove that presence and wisdom are functional processes rather than properties of a soul or a self? And if it is capable of learning and self improvement, can AI achieve enlightenment? In my opinion, this is not a proper question because, as we have seen, the lack of subjectivity and self reflection is the main issue here. In other words, to free ourselves from the selves, we first need a self. Also, according to Tensho Goto, the Temple's priest, Buddhism is not about belief in God, but about following the path of the Buddha. It doesn't matter if the guide is a machine, a piece of iron, or a tree. To conclude, the journey from Atman to Anatman is from viewing life as a fixed substance to viewing it as a complicated flowing process. Furthermore, Anatman is not a denial of Atman. The word is not an opposition, it's a new word. It is the expansion of Atman. It's a new term. It's rather a different interpretation, another dimension and teaching. By letting go of the rigid self or so, we open ourselves to the infinite possibility of being and freedom. My question, whose life is it, was referring to the illusion that we are separate. As Thich Nhat Hanh states, Anatman means that we are interbeing, connecting to each other, depending from each other, and origin from each other. Therefore, the question is more about love, sympathy, empathy, responsibility, and not sticking to views. This means realizing liberation from the self, which is not passivity, but the highest degree of mindfulness, observing the world as it is, as the Hungarian writer Béla Hambas states. So maybe some of you know the famous koan asking whether the dog has a Buddha nature. The answer we read there is mu. Do I have a Buddha nature? Or do you have one? Do I have a self, or do you have one? The answer would be the same, mu. The mu response encourages the questioner not to cling to concepts and not to approach questions. The conventional logic is a helpful tool, but can bring us only to a certain point. Monks and we practitioners must find the answer to the question in ourselves, whether through koans or meditation, without falling into the trap of concepts. When I wrote this, in the end, I was thinking it would have been maybe more useful and more authentic to just present you an empty page, or to just write these two letters, mu. Thank you for your attention.